the Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo in partnership with the Open University.
Industry is facing a sort of acid test in the way that social value is landing at the moment. And so it's not only an education of the suppliers, but it's also an education of the buyers and the clients, and making sure that they understand, how can we best apply social value in our procurement? What does that sort of best practice version look like?
Welcome to the Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo in partnership with the Open University, with me, Gerard Topless, the Group Chief Executive of Pagabo. There are many challenges that face our sector, and today we're going to talk about social value. What does it mean? How do we integrate social value into what we do, and how should we account for it? Now, for construction, cost is still the driving factor in many decisions. So how will we ensure the public sector is confident enough to include social value and whole life analysis in their decisions, especially when budgets will be squeezed over the next 5 years? Is it guidance we need, education, or a mandate?
The Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo.
So today I have with me Deepa Nair, the CSR and Social Value Lead at WSP, an international multidisciplinary consultancy, and Angus Townsend, the 55 Group Social Value Lead and Principal Consultant for our social value platform Loop. So let's start with what social value is. Deepa, can you give me your views on what it is?
Thanks, Gerard, and thanks for having me on the podcast today. So social value for me is really a way of describing, how we create those wider social, economic and environmental benefits as part of our procurement and as part of the delivery of our services. It's about securing that sort of greater value from monetary investment. Obviously, public spending is hugely under scrutiny at the moment, and there are sort of lots of questions as to how can we sort of balance up and level up society, of course. I think social value is a big part of generating that. And I would say within my role at WSP, my background is within corporate social responsibility, but actually sort of mobilizing that and paying it forward and making sure that we can actually sort of project that for that benefit onto communities is really how I see social value sort of taking it forward.
And Angus, just build a little bit on what Deepa has said there. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Thanks, Gerard, and thanks for having me as well. I think Deepa did a great job outlining the concept, and I suppose a couple of aspects to add to that. One is that it can be negative as well as positive, and often we focus purely on the positive, but it's important to have that net impact because you're looking at the relative importance of changes that people experience in their lives, and that can go either way. The other thing to add is that it's important to have a local focus on it and recognise that the context changes depending on who you're helping, who the change applies to, the context around them, the environment they live in. And that's another important factor for us to remember when tailoring it.
So that tailoring element that you referred to there, Angus, and sort of building that pay forward, I think is what you said, Deepa. Let's just talk a little bit about decision making then for clients. Social Value Act has been around since 2012. We've seen attempts to try and encourage that social value integration into procurement. But, where do you see it being used, Deepa, at WSP? I mean, is it in all of the decision-making process, at the beginning, the middle, the end? Where is it and where should it be?
So for us at WSP, obviously, as consultants and designers and planners, we are involved quite heavily at that early stage in any sort of project life cycle. And so for us, it's important to sort of embed it at that stage. Within the Construction Playbook, obviously, we're talking about, early supplier involvement and things like that. And so, it's that early stage for us really where the decisions are made. But that's not to say that it can't be flexible and it can't change over the course of the project life cycle. So for us, really, it's focusing on that as part of our early capture stages. We like to sort of understand the needs of the client as well as the communities. And as Angus mentioned there, obviously that sort of localism as part of it, understanding really how can we sort of tailor it down to the needs of the end stakeholders. And so for us, I think, really it's sort of as early as possible is key, and making sure that we can sort of have that iterative process throughout, not only our project involvement, but also beyond to the contractors and the construction companies that are involved sort of at those later stages. I will also mention that we are also beta testing the value-based toolkit, which is something that has recently launched by the Construction Innovation Hub. That sort of looks at it on a much, much broader scale. But that also is another example of sort of taking that value-based decision-making into account and making sure that, we understand what the client wants, what are the people's needs, and essentially sort of driving that outcome-based approach. So yeah, I would say that essentially as early as possible is important.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the value toolkit. We actually have a podcast in this series about the value toolkit specifically, actually, because it is referred to in the Construction Playbook, and it's out there, as you said. The earliest possible is again, the Construction Playbook talks a lot about early engagement and including the supply chain. But I suppose the bit I want to try and sort of understand, and I'll ask you, Angus, is on a project, the architects are very important. They're at the beginning, the cost consultants, the engineers, obviously the project managers. But do we put enough emphasis? Do we have social value experts at every stage now? I mean, in your role, you obviously see a wider brief because you see a lot of other organisations' integration of social value. So, are we seeing the importance of social value people, or how is that being used?
I'd say you could look at it both from having social value specialists, but also upskilling people in existing roles with that social value knowledge. I think, as Deepa says, you'd have it ideally embedded everywhere. And you could look at it much as you do with the budgeting or your costs or some of those other key factors. And in the same way, you would have people who understand the detail and specialize in that, but you'd also have others who understand the implications and how that can fit into decision making. So I think just integrating it would throughout a project and having the governance as well. So you have the people responsible for overseeing this all the way up to the top of an organization also means it sort of plays enough importance and has that significance.
Yeah, we obviously see that in what we do at the 55 Group, don't we, Angus? I mean, Deepa, from an education perspective, how many people have you got trained in social value? Is it as easy as measuring sort of ticks in boxes, or how do you actually assess that education piece Angus has referenced?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it also works sort of both ways. So of course there is obviously our side of things where it's, very much the sort of supplier perspective. We do have a sort of steering group within WSP, and we also have a social value advisory group, all of whom are sort of knowledgeable subject matter experts within the business and sort of help to not only sort of drive the discussion, but try and understand, what are the patterns, what's the current development within the industry. Kind of looking outwards as well, I've also noticed that given this is a relatively recent mandate that's come out from government, we're now starting to see that sort of pick up. And I guess sort of industry is facing a sort of acid test in the way that social value is landing at the moment. And so it's not only an education of the suppliers, but it's also an education of the buyers and the clients, and making sure that they understand, how can we best apply social value in our procurement? What does that sort of best practice version look like? So there have been bids in the past, which I've seen where there has been a very sort of general approach. And often I think that can be also quite hard for suppliers to be scored equitably. So, making sure that we have that understanding of what the procurement is about, who is supplying for it, and what is the most sort of relevant way of asking about social value and how can we actually embed this in a proportionate manner. So, yeah, I think it kind of works both ways. And I think there are players within the public sector space that are obviously pioneering within it as well, that are helping to sort of drive the message of social value, encourage its adoption. We've also had clients come and speak to us about how they are embedding social value within their business and their success stories as well as part of our key client manager conference. So there's lots of things happening, and most recently, I also attended a social value festival. I think it was the first of its kind from Essex County. Yeah, wow, from Essex County Council. That in itself was a really key kind of event, I think, just to sort of help drive social value, as well as sort of helping suppliers understand, how do you interact with businesses and charities and organisations within our area. So I think it's that collaboration that's really key. This is new for everybody. Everybody's on a journey. And so, making sure that we're all in conversation and trying to understand how best to apply it, I think is the way forward.
I mean, I'm very interested in the festival. I'm just thinking, was it Coldplay or Mumford and Sons who were actually playing at that sort of festival? But no, I mean, it's great that people are actually trying to use different formats and different sort of landscapes to actually promote it, I guess. That's really what the message coming out there. The procurement bit is quite interesting. Angus, I mean, how do you see it in the procurement process? Is it, we've got qualitative and quantitative analysis, so, experiences plus the numbers. I mean, are you seeing it through the work you do being used more in procurement, and if so, how?
Well, there's the mandated side, depending on where you're getting involved, with the social value model for central government having come out, sort of launched officially this January, which mandates that as a supplier to central government, at least 10%, and we often see 20% or even above, of your bid will be marked in terms of its social value impacts. So there's that part, and there's other requirements as well. For example, there's a similar PPN 0621, which above a certain threshold requires that you submit a carbon reduction plan. So there's sort of the mandatory side, but then you're seeing a lot of people go above and beyond that. Local government, for example, have always been well positioned, I mean, hence why they're festivals, I suppose, but they've often led the way, and they don't have this sort of mandated approach, but they use their own frameworks and ways of putting this in their procurement processes. Likewise with the private sector, with the rise of ESG influencing people in different ways, there's sort of this mix of mandatory and voluntary, and even a bit of a debate about what's the right way to drive this significant scale of change and the speed of it that's required. Is it led by government and mandated and driven, or is it sort of encouraged amongst the private sector? And the business case that is there helps pull them along, a bit of a carrot and stick. But I think either way, the changes are coming, so it makes sense to get your head around them early.
I think you raised a couple of interesting points there. I mean, I know at Pagabo, we have leaned very heavily into the direction of social value as part of that procurement process. And it's great to see. And we've actually had a lot of compliments from the clients in that regard. Now, we started our journey before the pandemic. Now, obviously, the pandemic has changed a lot of our views on, obviously, quite a lot of things. One of them is being cost. So I'm just sort of interested deeper. The point I made at the beginning, that cost is still an important factor. You can't award every decision purely on social value outcomes. That would probably not be economically viable. Are you seeing a sort of challenge now between cost and social value, particularly as we start to look at newer projects?
So I think cost in general, we're definitely moving past it. It's not just about sort of, cost and quality anymore. It's obviously that social value element is coming into play. I think it's interesting because obviously the industry this has now been pushed out, and in some way I think that the way that in which we deliver our initiatives, it doesn't always have to be that it's the best, the most expensive or the highest value that tends to win. It's always the consideration of, do you understand what our community needs? Do you understand what our stakeholders need? And it really focuses in on that sort of needs-based view more than anything. I think where there are procurements whereby the highest value wins, I don't necessarily see that as sort of surviving in the long term. Obviously, with not only looking at sort of that side of things, there's also, if you consider the legislation, monetary gauges, for example, in Scotland aren't allowed as part of the submission. So we are certainly moving away from that. And I think there is that focus on the qualitative and understanding ultimately what is the need and how are we going to meet that. So, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, it was an interesting point you made there about Scotland, because they refer to social value as community benefit, don't they, in Scotland? And it is purely qualitative sort of submissions, the experiences, the relative change, and those examples, I think. I mean, one of the things we're sort of seeing, and I've seen it a little bit with the work I've done with the DFT, is this thing called optioneering. And I think you sort of touched on a bit there deeper, the idea that you might look at several sort of roadmaps to where you want to be as a client. And then depending on that, then the actual decision makers will then sort of choose it. And what you need to be able to do then is to run several different scenarios to create that proper landscape of options. And I can sort of see that coming. I want to just ask a real simple question to you both. I'll start with Angus. I mean, you mentioned ESG. I think you both have, actually, and the private sector. I'm not trying to be controversial here, but is the private sector better at social value than the public sector? Angus?
Well, it's very different, and ESG is very much a private sector framework, and the government and public sector has its own versions of that, and they're all covering similar topics, but it's coming at it from a different angle. Particularly ESG is very investor focused. So I think if you're looking at their performance, naturally the private sector varies business to business, and you tend to get the full range, which is natural, as we touched on, that mixture of voluntary and mandatory. But when you're left to sort of find your own strategic approach and you have different circumstances, you'll react in different ways. For some, the rise of ESG will be a stronger case for making those changes, and the asks investors put on them, as well as customers and the workforce sort of expectations increasing. And even within the public sector, as I touched on, there is a difference between local government and central government, although central government is now setting the agenda more recently, but local government has tended to lead the way historically. So I'd say there's sort of a mix within both sides. It's hard to group them into sort of one versus the other.
Is it now a requirement for companies to have a social value policy and an ESG policy then? Is that where we're going?
Well, Deepa's well placed to answer that one, but I think that as a result of having these different approaches come not from a coordinated base, but covering similar topics from different angles and different interests, is that you can get overlap and the divides aren't always clear. You throw sustainability policies in there as well.
Is that? I mean, Angus has referenced you there, Deepa. Do you at WSP have an ESG and a social value policy?
So yeah, it's interesting. I think we are moving towards the sort of the ESG space within WSP. Our global business has an ESG policy, but we in the UK have sort of decided to go with a sustainability policy and a social value policy for now. I do see it shifting though. It's something that we're looking to sort of build in as part of our broader corporate strategy within the UK as well. And I think previously one of the things that you mentioned as well was talking about private sector and how they are sort of ultimately reacting to this. It's been interesting because I do think private sector is in some way leading in the way of social value. ESG is obviously the separate kind of piece, which is now coming up in a big way. But one of the things that we have at WSP, I've certainly noticed over the years, we're aiming to become net zero as a business by 2025. And one of the things that we currently sort of work on is our green leases. So that's working with some of our private real estate partners and agents to sort of help agree and, let's say, align with this sustainable office standard that we have across all of our estate. And a couple of years ago, that was something that was relatively new and a lot of our agents maybe didn't always sign up to. And as part of our sort of agreement, we always want it to be that any of our new real estate or any of our new sort of tenancies all sign up to this green lease. And it's only recently that we've started to sort of proactively see more traction and more of a response to it. So I've noticed that obviously, real estate companies, you could almost argue that a lot of them are sort of very pure private sector, and they don't necessarily have that view of the public sector and that involvement. So I would say that that's something that's shifted, and it's through that I think that we're starting to see this greater adoption, let's say, of sustainable practices, of better behaviours overall, let's say.
Yeah, well, I hope we're seeing that. I mean, the sort of ambitions and the sort of motivations for younger people who are certainly joining our sector. They have a different approach, and I think we will see that sort of come through what we do. I mean, what are we doing at the 55 group, Angus, in terms of ESG and social value?
Yes, so we're going on our own internal ESG journey. We're setting up our reporting in that area using the GRI framework, but we're also tying that in with working towards becoming a B Corp, which again covers a lot of similar topics and is essentially another framework, but it's assessed and you have to pass a certain level to become one, and then by doing so it's sort of a verified view of your business that it's achieving those highest social and environmental standards. So that's something we're really keen to move through. It's a bit of a long process, but it's interesting to go on ourselves, and then helps us feed into our external offerings. So we're looking at adding an ESG dashboard onto our core Loop software, so that we can help map between ESG and social value, because as we've touched on, there's a lot of different approaches and overlapping frameworks. So it's one we want to improve and help people navigate.
That's, we're sort of all enjoying that sort of process, I think. And it's obviously easier for larger companies probably to adopt a lot of this, but it's also important for all companies to consider it. So the two things came out of what Angus said there really, and it links back to the Construction Playbook. In terms of the supply chain, number one, we know larger contractors and consultants have got that experience. They've got people like Deepa specifically aligned to this agenda. They've got the tools, they've got the resources. But what about supply chains for those smaller and even micro businesses? How do we include them on this journey? Because if we don't, everything stops at that sort of first sort of order we give to our supply chain. And we all know in our industry, nearly 2/3 of the work on site is actually done by other companies. So Deepa, how are you ensuring it goes through your supply chain?
So that's been a big part, I think, of our general sort of internal stakeholder engagement, I would say. So as part of our strategy, just generally, we're working with lots of different corporate functions within WSP. So, that's our wellbeing teams, our HR teams, our supply chain teams. And so looking at that procurement piece, I think for us was really high up the list. And so most recently we've updated and revitalized our procurement policy to account for not only for social value, but also we've alongside that published a social value supply chain charter, which looks to sort of set out that expectation for our suppliers. It's the first interface that they receive really as part of the process of joining us as a supplier. So yeah, as part of that, it really sort of sets out our social value policy, our expectations, what we're looking to deliver and commit to really as part of our project. So that's one side of it. There's very much that governance side. The other side of it is part of our engagement, and we have a broader supplier diversity program at WSP, because I would say also there is that cultural shift for a lot of our colleagues, taking on SMEs, MSMEs. It's a relatively new thing, I would say, and it doesn't come sort of naturally to everybody. So we're trying to do that engagement separately and, really sort of working with supplier forums such as MSD UK, which really focuses on ethnic minority-owned businesses. And another forum that we're looking at the moment and working with is We Connect, which is women-owned businesses. So it's through that sort of sharing of knowledge and just that dialogue, let's say, with these forums, trying to understand their needs and removing some of those blockers, let's say. That's what's important to us at this stage, and obviously starting that dialogue, as I mentioned. And it's often these smaller companies that bring about that sort of agility, that innovation, and that sort of localized thinking. So really, it's a key opportunity for any large organizations to consider this and start to build it in.
And, of all the work you're doing, it's very, very positive. Are you finding that the smaller businesses and the MSMEs, as you call them, are they taking up the mantle?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a slow process, but it's something that I would say is there's certainly that appetite from SMEs and MSMEs that I've spoken to. From their perspective, they want to be up there. They want to be working with the larger organizations and they want to be on a level playing field. So, so I would say that there has definitely been a positive reaction to this outreach and knowledge sharing that we're trying to bring about. That's
great. So probably from your perspective, Angus, you work in the sort of technical social value part of our business. The Construction Playbook tells us innovation and technology are vital in order to make us more efficient, to make us better informed, to allow us to make better decisions. So, the Loop software, is that helping? Does it help with the heavy lifting? What about the heavy thinking? How should people consider using technology?
Yeah, and actually it links to what we were just talking about there in terms of SMEs and VCSEs. I think the key role that technology has enabled us to take is to make this more accessible and often more affordable to these small organisations where they could lack the means to carry out these large technical reports or pieces of work, or having to suddenly get on board with these strategies and policies. So it makes that measurement and management, and therefore the improvement of social impact, very much up for grabs. And I think that's the key to supporting the scale of change that customers, workers, the planet now need. We need to bring everyone on board, and it's a sort of viable and accessible tool.
Loop obviously allows you to measure the numbers and also the quality. But I guess the other part of innovation, what the Construction Playbook talks a lot about, is modern methods of construction, MMC as it's referred to. And obviously, comparing the social value you get from a traditional construction or traditional project against the social value you might get from an MMC project is now coming into the frame. And obviously, software can actually help you calculate that very quickly. But I suppose a question for you, Deepa, just as it's more of an understanding perspective. We talk about levelling up in the UK, and social value could be seen to help or possibly hinder that if we're not careful. Now, obviously, if you do work in London, but you make all of the products in Newcastle, big geographic difference there. And how are we acknowledging the fact that the social value is delivered quite differently? And is the government sort of requiring us to consider that? And how should we consider it? Because matching that localisation could be quite difficult. How are you seeing that happen at WSP?
So yeah, I think it's interesting because I think MMC, modern methods of construction, is bringing with it a load of potential around social value. Obviously, when we're looking at sort of off-site construction and things like that, coming to some of these cities outside of the centre, the opportunities there are huge. And it's not only about sort of that training and upskilling, it's also about the retention of jobs, the economic benefits that can be created in some of these, cities really that aren't sort of normally traditionally getting the benefits that you do tend to get in the centre. So I do see this moving, and I do see this sort of growing opportunity, let's say, with MMC in the way of social value. Ultimately, I think it's something that, government has now brought about as part of the Construction Playbook. It's fully embedded in there. It's here to stay. So yeah, I can see that the benefits to be had are huge. And really, we've talked about throughout this conversation today, localization, understanding the needs, what are the best outcomes for everybody really at the end of the project. And that not only looks at the community, it also looks at the workforce. So ensuring that consideration is also there as part of that construction process is vital.
Angus, might just be interested in your sort of perspective, because I know at Loop you're doing some work with the Tides Living Lab on a modern methods calculator, and obviously you've done work with the rail industry with their rail social value tool. I guess technology can help quite a lot in performing those calculations quickly, but do you are there real benefits that you're seeing from a social value perspective for MMC?
Yeah, and I think Deepa covered a lot there. The point I would add just comes back to what social value is really trying to do. It's trying to give you that holistic understanding of where those impacts are and where that the way you can drive that net benefit. And I think if you're looking to address regional inequalities, you need to understand where these impacts are hitting, and also, as Deepa was saying, understand the best options. And to do that, you need the whole picture, not just some of the existing metrics and ways of judging these things. So I think that's sort of the big impact. And yeah, absolutely, with MMC and our rail social value tool, it goes in another level into those industries, and it provides a bespoke view, so you get even more detail on that same question.
Yeah, there's regional differences are very important, because I see it a lot about skills. I see levelling up not just as a geographic thing. I see it as a whole skill thing, and bringing our whole economy and people and taking everybody with it really. And I think if the government can get that message across, then I think we'll all be better for that. So look, we've had a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, hearing from both Deepa and Angus. I always like to ask one final question to my guests. And I do ask you to try and be really quite concise with your answer if you can, please. So a final question for you both, and I'll start with you, Deepa. What is your top tip that you think our listeners need to consider, whether they are a client or a user of the Construction Playbook? What is the thing they need to consider based on your views of social value?
So I'd say, firstly, sort of get to know the Construction Playbook. I think there are sort of 14 key policies there, and all very sort of relevant, and it's going to be actively now sort of guiding our procurement. So it's important to really sort of get comfortable with it. Beyond that, I think net zero and sort of delivering greener, it's obviously a key theme in itself, as well as sort of sitting under the umbrella of social value. At WSP, we are also looking to halve the carbon in our designs and advice by 2030. So for us, we're moving it forward, and we're trying to embed it in our way of working for our colleagues. So those are the sort of, I guess, top tips. I would also say that another area which WSP are involved in is, I think recently there has been this consultation around the gold standard for frameworks led by David Mosey. So that's also something that we've recently fed into, and there'll be a report coming out very shortly on that. So that's also looking to focus on that sort of gold standard, that best practice there in terms of delivering construction frameworks. So yeah, I would say to look out for that as well.
That's you've had more than one top tip there, Deepa. So,
Sorry.
I will let you have that. So, and I think on the gold standard frameworks, I'd like to think at Pagabo we're probably already doing that and hopefully exceeding it. We've been a great promoter of a lot of innovation and the Construction Playbook in what we do. So, Angus, what's your top tip?
Well, more generally, I think with social value, especially after what we've talked about today, it can be quite easy to get overwhelmed by it. You suddenly think you need to be excelling in this and that and have all these policies. And I suppose my tip would be to take it stage by stage and build it in a structured and robust way. Measure and work out where you stand now and then look strategically at where you can drive improvement, in that prioritization and phasing of it. I think government and tendering organizations are understanding of that. If you can show you're taking real action and are serious about heading in the right direction, I think, as we mentioned before, we're all on a journey and people want to work with you.
So, I think that's a great tip. So social value is a 60-inch pizza, which we should eat slice by slice. Is that right, Angus?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Sounds about right.
That's about right. Okay. Look, I just want to say thank you to my guests. It's been a great topic. It is a great topic. It's very close to my heart, actually, as well. And it was just great to hear some views, some considerations, some things we should all think about. So I just want to say thank you for listening to our podcast, and thank you to my guests, Deepa Nair, who's the CSR and Social Value Lead at WSP, and Angus Townsend, the 55 Group Social Value Lead and Principal Consultant at our social value platform, Loop. So thanks again. Look out for our next podcast, and we'll see you all again soon.